the gold lose, the people who might buy the gold gain, right? And so that means that on net, you haven't made anyone worse off or better off, because positive externalities to the people who buy gold and negative externalities to the people who sell gold, and on net, you don't cause anything. So the reason why that happens is the externality that you caused was mediated through a change in prices. Anytime the externalities you cause come because the prices change, that means that whoever's buying will benefit, and if you lower the price, and whoever is selling will lose, but on net you won't cause any harm to anyone, right? And that situation is not a real externality, or what's called technical externality, because it doesn't create any efficiency. Instead, it's called a pecuniary externality. So anytime something you do causes the price to change and therefore harms some people and benefits others, it doesn't on net cause any inefficiency, and it's called a pecuniary externality. So this is one of the most common misapplications of the theories of externalities. In fact, you often hear people advocating interventions to deal with pecuniary externalities, even though they're not really externalities. So one thing you often hear is that competition between companies, creates negative externalities because I hurt the other company. But let's think about this. Victor? Yeah. If I compete with you and that causes the prices in the industry to fall, is that a real externality?
No, I mean, that's like the market and not like inefficiencies.
So, in particular, why? Given our logic. So if I come into the industry I wasn't in before, me coming in, the prices fall.
Well, that makes the consumers better off, right?
Yeah. And it makes my competitors worse off by the same amount, so there's no externality. Right. But what if I don't lower the price, but I just come in and take some of the sales away from you that you were making a profit on? Then is there an externality?
No, I mean, you're making the benefit though, right? And they're not?
So the answer is no, actually, that is an externality. So if I come in and don't change the prices, but I take some of your profitable sales away, that is a negative externality on you, and it's not a positive externality on the consumers, because the consumers were just as happy as buying the original good. And so that means that in that case, I do have a negative externality. So you have to be very careful about these things. You have to be clear whether it's the price changing that mediates the externality, or whether it's a change in quantities, or a change in some technical aspect which mediates the externality.
Can you give an example?
Yeah.
For like taking sales away from prices, because that seems kind of counterintuitive.
Well, I think that you can imagine that happening. So imagine that there's a market, there's a firm that's currently a monopoly. A new firm comes into the industry, takes half of their market, but then colludes with them and keeps the price up at the monopoly price, right? Then clearly that's a negative externality on your competitor and doesn't do any good for consumers, right? In fact, yeah, you'll see this popping up throughout the course. So another example would be, imagine that free trade with China causes a steel worker to lose their job. Well, for all the harm that was done to that steel worker, there were benefits to the consumers, and so that free trade with China is not really an externality. Similarly, polluting a lake can harm the consumers of the fish that come from that lake, because it can cause the price of the fish to rise. Now, that should also just be a pecuniary externality, right? Because it's going to benefit the people who produce the fish just as much as it harms the consumers. But it definitely seems like putting pollution into a lake should be an externality. So David, what do you think is who is the real victim of the externality when you pollute the lake?
Which state? I think, yeah, I mean, I'd say The fish and the people around the lake, because they have to deal with smog or bad water.
But imagine the only effect of the pollution is to kill off a bunch of fish, and that we don't consider fish to be people, so we can't look at them as victims of externality. So then who is the real victim of the externality of the pollution?
And you're saying the people who have to deal with the higher prices for fish aren't...
No, because that's offset. That's just mediated through prices, right? If the price of fish rises, right, then that benefits the people who sell the fish and harms the people who buy the fish. So that's just a pecuniary externality. What's the real externality here?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
You want to go ahead,
I
Karen?
was going to say fishermen, but
Yeah, that's basic. I think that's basically right. It's the fishermen who own the lake. It's whoever owns the lake, right? Now that might be the government, or there might be fishermen who have like the exclusive right to fish there. They're the ones who are harmed, right? So it's always the person who directly gets the harm, rather than people who are indirectly affected by things mediated through changes in prices, who are the real victims of externalities. Similarly, imagine that you have a brilliant roommate who gets stoned and helps you beat the curve as a result, right? Well, that might benefit you because you get a better grade, but it harms everybody else in the school who now has basically their grades look less good because you, for not doing as much effort, got a higher grade, right? So that's again, it has positive and negative externalities. Or if you think of selective abortion of women, which is very common in East Asia and South Asia, basically makes other women better off because they're able to get higher status men, right? But that harms the men at the same time, right? So even though that's not exactly a market, you see these other non-market situations have similar dynamics, that by removing competition for grades or for mates, the other side loses if your side gains. And so those selective abortions don't exert positive externalities, they only create pecuniary externalities. Okay, so this distinction between pecuniary and non-pecuniary externalities also shows up in the calculation of damages in liability in legal cases. And there's a distinction between what are called physical damages, which is like if you hit a doctor with a car, or if you burn down somebody's house, or you defame someone's character with libel, you should have to pay them for that. These are called direct harms or physical harms. Now in the case of libel, it wasn't really a physical harm, but it was directly affecting that person. On the other hand, there's a second category called pure economic losses. So for example, the patients who no longer have a doctor are not directly harmed by this externality. They're only indirectly harmed, because basically that's equivalent to them now having to go out and look for another doctor, so other doctors will benefit by having them, even if they're harmed. Similarly, if the home values rise in that neighborhood, because now there's less houses, that is only a pecuniary externality, because the people who might buy the houses are going to be worse off, even if the people who currently own the houses are better off. On the other hand, imagine that that house was really beautiful, and when it burns down, the prices of the other houses fall, because now people don't want to live in the neighborhood because there was this beautiful house before and now there's not. That was an externality that was being created by that house. So burning it down removes that externality and therefore causes a negative externality to the people owning the other homes. So again, the key thing is, are things mediated through prices, or are they independent and come through some channel that's external to the price system? The reason why these things are called pure economic losses is because they're price-mediated economic harms, just like pecuniary externalities. So this has been a huge issue in the Deepwater Horizon spill, trying to figure out what things are actually direct externalities created by that, and what things were merely economic damages. And I want to go through a few examples to try to get you guys to figure out the differences. So, Shin, what do you think that the shrimping employees who lost their jobs deserve compensation for the Deepwater Horizon based on this?
Yes, because they lost from the loss of a common good, which other ships.
So the shrimping employees don't actually own any of the water into which the oil was dumped, right? They're employed by an industry based on that, and therefore the fall in their wages benefits whoever is their next employer. And so it's not, they're not really damaged by that. Second, how about Sharda? What about a government conservation agency that has the responsibility of protecting birds in the area? Are they harmed directly?
I guess I can say our problem right now because we have a bunch of birds that are collecting oil.
So why is that a direct rather than a pecuniary externality?
It's direct rather than pecuniary because it's not a pure economic loss that's occurring. Like there's actual physical harm that's going on.
Yeah, that's right. The agency in some sense owns the birds, right? It's like, if anybody, no one really owns the birds, but they have the responsibility for taking care of the birds for the public trust. So when those birds are killed, they're worse off. It's like a zoo would be worse off if you killed a bunch of the animals in the zoo, right? Because they have the responsibility of protecting those. They're not indirectly harmed by a change in market conditions. They're directly harmed by the destruction of the birds, right? How about, Jace, what do you think about the Louisiana hotels that serve people who come down to eat shrimp in Louisiana? Are they harmed directly or indirectly?
I think they're harmed indirectly because they lose that industry, their prices fall, and that'll benefit the consumers.
Yeah, exactly. So it'll be cheaper to go to Louisiana now. They're worse off only because it's become cheaper, and so that's an indirect, pure economic loss. Michael, what about Michael Wing? What about disrupted shippers who ship through the port of New Orleans?
I think it's direct because it affects all the shippers, and it doesn't make anybody or it could be better off because the boats are already built before.
No, I think it's sort of a combination of both. So if somebody owned the port and was charging a lot for the port, then it wouldn't be a direct externality on the shippers, right? Because the price of the port would go down, and that would actually benefit the shippers, right? But that's not really how it works. In the end, they don't actually pay to use the port. And because they don't pay to use the port, effectively they own part of the port themselves. And so they are somewhat directly harmed.
I was also thinking because like shippers, they usually ship to one place. They don't really change the ports often, so they're worse off.
Yeah. Well, it's because they sort of own the port because they're not paying for it. If they were paying for it, then it would be an indirect loss to them and a direct loss to whoever owned the port. But because they don't really pay for the port, it's a direct loss to them because they sort of are owners of it. So this stuff is quite tricky, but it's very, very important because this can be used to make very fallacious arguments about public policy. Okay, so not everything that's a real externality happens across people necessarily. And on the other hand, not everything across people is a real externality, as we just saw, right? Because a lot of these things are pecuniary, but conversely, it's